Sometimes the greatest acts of love require the greatest sacrifice. In one terrible, beautiful moment, a stranger's kindness can change everything we thought we knew about ourselves. In the Colorado Territory of 1887, Cowboy Wyatt Morgan heard a woman's screams and didn't think twice about rushing toward danger. The mountain lion's claws would take his leg, but he saved Eliza Hartford's life. She was the daughter of Denver's richest railroad baron. He was just a drifter with nothing but his horse and his honor. Stranded together in the wilderness, something unexpected happened between them. When rescue came, Eliza faced an impossible choice. Would she return to her comfortable life or follow her heart? What she decided to do for the man who sacrificed everything for her will restore your faith in human goodness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine-covered slopes of the Colorado Rockies like a gentle embrace, filtering the early sunlight into golden shafts that danced through the towering evergreens. The year was 1887, and the territory still held that wild, untamed quality that made city folk feel both exhilarated and afraid. In a small leather pouch tucked inside his worn saddlebags, Wyatt Morgan carried his most precious possession, his father's cavalry saber, tarnished now, but still bearing the weight of honor that had shaped 3 generations of Morgan men. Wyatt guided his chestnut mare along the narrow mountain trail, his weathered hands steady on the reins despite the early morning chill that bit at his fingers. At 32, he bore the lean, sun-darkened look of a man who had spent most of his adult life under open sky. His father had died at Gettysburg when Wyatt was barely 14, leaving behind only that saber and a philosophy carved deep into his son's character. A man's worth wasn't measured by what he owned, but by what he was willing to sacrifice for others. The past 18 years had taught Wyatt the truth of those words. After losing the family farm to drought and debt, he'd taken to the cowboy's life, driving cattle across vast stretches of prairie, working ranches from Texas to Montana, always moving, always earning just enough to keep his horse fed and his boots mended. He wasn't bitter about his circumstances. A man made his peace with life's hand, and Wyatt had learned to find satisfaction in honest work, the company of good horses, and the vast freedom of the frontier. This morning found him riding toward Leadville, where he'd heard tell of ranching work that might last through the winter. The previous evening, he'd made camp near a creek that tumbled down from the high peaks, sharing his simple meal of beans and hardtack with his mare, Sagebrush. She was getting on in years, like him, but still sure-footed on the mountain trails. They understood each other, horse and rider, both creatures who knew that survival depended on mutual trust and careful attention to the world around them. The sound of voices ahead made Wyatt slow his approach. Around a bend in the trail, he could see a small expedition camped beside a meadow dotted with late-season wildflowers. 3 canvas tents were arranged in a neat triangle, with a proper cooking fire and enough gear to suggest these weren't ordinary travelers. A string of fine horses grazed nearby, their breeding evident even at a distance. This was money on the move, the kind of people who brought the comforts of civilization into the wilderness. As Wyatt drew closer, he observed the camp's occupants with the careful eye of a man who had learned to read situations quickly. An older woman in traveling dress sat on a folding camp chair, her steel-gray hair pinned severely beneath a practical hat. Her posture spoke of rigid propriety, and she watched the surrounding forest as if expecting it to produce something unseemly at any moment. This would be the chaperone, Wyatt decided, the kind of guardian wealthy families hired to ensure their precious charges didn't encounter anything too adventurous. Near the fire, a weathered man in buckskins tended to the morning meal. His movements showed the easy competence of someone who knew the country, but his eyes held a tension that Wyatt recognized. Samuel Torres had been guiding city folk into the mountains for 15 years, and while the work paid well, it carried responsibilities that weighed heavy on a man's conscience. Every expedition brought new worries, spoiled travelers who didn't understand the dangers, unpredictable weather, and the constant awareness that a single mistake could turn adventure into tragedy. But it was the third member of the party who captured Wyatt's attention. She stood at the edge of the meadow, her back to the camp, arms wrapped around herself as she gazed up at the towering peaks that rose like cathedral spires into the morning sky. Even from a distance, there was something in her posture that spoke of restlessness, of a spirit that felt confined despite the vast wilderness around her. She wore a riding dress of fine brown wool, practical but clearly expensive, and her dark hair was pinned up in a style that managed to look elegant even after a night of camping. Wyatt touched the brim of his hat and called out a greeting as he approached. "Morning, folks. Fine day for traveling." The older woman, Mrs. Whitman, as he would soon learn, looked up with the sort of expression reserved for unexpected interruptions. Samuel Torres straightened from the fire, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle that leaned against a nearby tree. But the young woman at the meadow's edge turned with genuine interest, her face lighting with the kind of curiosity that civilization often tried to dampen in well-bred ladies. "Good morning," she said, stepping forward with a grace that seemed natural rather than practiced. "I'm Eliza Hartford. Are you familiar with these trails?" Up close, Wyatt could see that she was perhaps 24 or 25, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of complexion that spoke of careful protection from the sun. But there was something else there too, a restlessness, a hunger for something beyond the careful boundaries of her privileged world. Around her neck, she wore a delicate pearl locket that caught the morning light, and Wyatt found himself wondering what treasured memory it might hold. "Wyatt Morgan, ma'am," he replied, dismounting with the easy grace of long practice. "I know these mountains pretty well, been riding through them for the better part of 20 years. Mrs. Whitman cleared her throat meaningfully. "Miss Hartford, perhaps you should rejoin us by the fire." But Eliza ignored her chaperone's gentle rebuke. "Mr. Morgan, we're traveling to the hot springs near Glenwood. Samuel, our guide, says we should reach them by late afternoon, but I confess I'm hoping the journey might take a bit longer. These mountains are so beautiful, and back in Denver, well," she paused, as if catching herself before revealing too much. "One doesn't often have the opportunity to see such country." Wyatt recognized something in her voice that he'd heard in his own thoughts many times, the need for freedom, for something real and unscripted. This was a woman who had been raised in drawing rooms and finishing schools, but whose spirit yearned for the kind of authentic experience that couldn't be bought or arranged by well-meaning families. Samuel Torres approached, extending a weathered hand. "Sam Torres, I appreciate you stopping by, Morgan. Always good to see another man who knows the country. You, heading toward Leadville?" "That's the plan," Wyatt replied, shaking the guide's hand and noting the firm grip and honest eyes. "Heard there might be ranch work available before the snow flies. There's always work for a man who's not afraid of hard winters," Samuel agreed. "Though I'd be careful on the trail ahead. Saw a sign yesterday that suggested we might have company, the four-legged kind that doesn't appreciate visitors." Wyatt understood immediately. "Mountain lion?" "Big Tom, from the look of the tracks, probably following the deer herds down from the high country." Samuel glanced meaningfully toward Eliza, who was listening with obvious fascination rather than the fear that might have been expected from a sheltered city woman. "We've been keeping a careful watch, especially during the evening hours." Mrs. Whitman stood abruptly, her face pale. "Samuel, you didn't mention any danger when we—" "No real cause for concern, ma'am," the guide said quickly. "Mountain lions generally avoid people, especially groups. It's just a matter of staying alert and keeping the fire burning at night." Eliza stepped closer, her eyes bright with interest rather than fear. "Have you ever encountered one, Mr. Morgan?" "A few times," Wyatt admitted. They're magnificent animals, but not to be taken lightly. A big cat like that, well, it's earned its place at the top of these mountains through strength and cunning. Best to give such creatures the respect they deserve. Something in his tone seemed to resonate with her, and for a moment their eyes met with a recognition that neither could have explained. Both of them understood something about the need to prove oneself, to earn one's place through character rather than circumstance. Mrs. Whitman's voice cut through the moment with practiced authority. "Eliza, dear, we really must prepare for departure. Your father expects us to maintain a proper schedule." The mention of Eliza's father brought a slight tightening around her eyes, and Wyatt found himself wondering what expectations and obligations waited for her back in Denver. He had heard of the Hartford family. Everyone in Colorado Territory knew of Jonathan Hartford's railroad empire and his influence in bringing civilization to the frontier. A man like that would have particular ideas about his daughter's future, ideas that probably didn't include lingering conversations with drifting cowboys. "Of course, Mrs. Whitman," Eliza said, but her tone suggested duty rather than enthusiasm. She turned back to Wyatt. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Mr. Morgan. I hope you find the work you're seeking. Thank you, Miss Hartford. I hope your journey brings you everything you're looking for." As he spoke, Wyatt caught something in her expression, a flicker of uncertainty, as if she wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for. It was an expression he understood well, having worn it himself during the long, searching years after leaving the family farm. He remounted Sagebrush and touched his hat brim in farewell. "Safe travels, folks. Keep your eyes open and your rifle handy." As he rode away, Wyatt found himself thinking about Eliza Hartford, not just her obvious beauty, but the intelligence in her eyes and the way she had listened to talk of mountain lions with curiosity rather than fashionable fear. There was substance there, beneath the careful polish of her upbringing. In another life, under different circumstances, she might have been the kind of woman who could understand the appeal of an honest, simple existence far from the complicated machinery of wealth and social position. But that was idle thinking for a man like him. Their paths had crossed for a few minutes on a mountain trail, and now they would diverge again, carrying them toward very different destinations. She would return to Denver society, with its grand balls and business arrangements, while he would find work with some remote ranch, spending the winter months mending fences and tending cattle in solitude. Still, as Sagebrush picked her way along the rocky trail, Wyatt found himself hoping that Eliza Hartford's expedition would give her at least a taste of the freedom she seemed to crave. The mountains had a way of showing people who they really were, beneath all the expectations and obligations that others placed upon them. Behind him, the camp was already breaking up, with Samuel Torres directing the careful packing of expensive gear, while Mrs. Whitman supervised with obvious anxiety. And somewhere in the midst of that organized activity, a young woman was tucking a pearl locket beneath her traveling dress and wondering if the safe, predetermined path laid out for her was really the one she wanted to follow. The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing the full majesty of the peaks that surrounded them all. It was going to be a beautiful day for traveling, though none of them could have guessed how dramatically their separate journeys would soon converge. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pine trees as Eliza Hartford walked ahead of the expedition, despite Mrs. Whitman's repeated calls to stay closer to the group. Something about the morning's encounter with the cowboy had stirred a restlessness in her that she couldn't quite name. Wyatt Morgan had spoken to her as an equal, not as a delicate flower to be protected from life's realities. His mention of the mountain lion had thrilled rather than frightened her, and she found herself hoping for some genuine adventure before returning to the suffocating expectations of Denver society. The red silk bandana around her neck, a small rebellion against Mrs. Whitman's insistence on proper attire, fluttered in the mountain breeze. She had taken it from her traveling trunk that morning, drawn by its vibrant color and the way it seemed to capture something of the wild freedom these mountains represented. Little did she know that this simple piece of cloth would soon become stained with blood and bound forever to an act of extraordinary courage. Samuel Torres had been growing increasingly uneasy as the day progressed. The mountain lion tracks they'd encountered earlier were fresher than he'd admitted to his charges, and the peculiar silence of the forest suggested that local wildlife was avoiding this section of trail. His experienced eye caught signs that the others missed scratches on tree bark too high for any creature except a large cat. The nervous behavior of their horses and the absence of birdsong that usually accompanied their passage through the wilderness. "Miss Hartford," he called, his voice carrying more authority than usual. "Please stay within sight of the group. These mountains can be deceiving, and it's easy to become separated." But Eliza was already 50 yards ahead, drawn by the sight of a small waterfall that tumbled down a granite cliff face. The sound of rushing water had masked the approach of footsteps, and she turned with a smile, expecting to see Samuel or perhaps Mrs. Whitman coming to fetch her back to the safety of the group. Instead, she found herself face to face with death. The mountain lion was magnificent and terrifying, a creature of raw power and predatory grace, nearly 8 feet from nose to tail, with shoulders that spoke of incredible strength. The big Tom had been tracking the expedition for the better part of an hour. Hunger had driven him down from the high country, and the scent of horses and humans had triggered ancient hunting instincts that no amount of caution could override. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, woman and predator stared at each other across 20 feet of pine needle-covered ground. Eliza's mind, trained by years of proper education, supplied useless information about remaining calm and backing away slowly. But her body, flooded with primitive terror, could only stand frozen as the great cat's muscles bunched beneath its tawny coat. The lion's scream shattered the mountain silence, a sound like a woman in mortal agony that echoed off the surrounding peaks and sent every bird within a mile radius into panicked flight. It was a sound that spoke of hunger and desperation, of a predator that had made its decision and would not be deterred. Eliza's own scream answered the lion's challenge, a cry of pure terror that carried through the forest like a prayer for salvation. Her legs finally obeyed her mind's frantic commands, and she stumbled backward, her fine riding boots slipping on the treacherous carpet of fallen leaves and exposed roots. The mountain lion gathered itself for the killing leap, its powerful hindquarters coiling like springs as it prepared to cover the distance between predator and prey in a single, devastating bound. Its yellow eyes held no malice, only the ancient calculation of a creature that killed to survive. But salvation came thundering through the trees in the form of a chestnut mare and her rider, a man who had heard that terrifying scream and responded without thought for his own safety. Wyatt Morgan drove Sagebrush toward the sound of danger at a pace that would have been reckless under normal circumstances and was simply insane given the rocky, tree-covered terrain. Branches whipped at his face and tore at his clothes as he forced his mount through the forest, guided only by Eliza's continued screams and an instinct honed by years of living close to danger. The cavalry saber his father had carried at Gettysburg bounced against his leg, but there was no time to draw it. This would be a fight that required more immediate weapons. Wyatt burst into the small clearing just as the mountain lion left the ground, its massive form silhouetted against the afternoon sky in a leap that would have carried it directly onto Eliza's slight frame. Without hesitation, he threw himself from Sagebrush's back, his own body becoming a projectile aimed at intercepting the predator's flight. The collision was tremendous. 180 pounds of determined Cowboy met nearly 200 pounds of airborne mountain lion in a crash that echoed through the forest like a thunderclap. Both man and beast went down in a tangle of claws and limbs, rolling across the rocky ground in a desperate struggle that would have only one survivor. Wyatt's knife appeared in his hand as if by magic, the worn bone handle fitting his palm with the familiarity of 20 years' practice. But the mountain lion was fighting for its life now, and cornered predators were the most dangerous creatures on Earth. Its rear claws, designed by nature to disembowel prey, found purchase on Wyatt's left leg and began the terrible work they had evolved to perform. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but Wyatt had been hurt before and knew that giving in to agony meant death for both himself and the woman he was trying to save. He drove his knife toward the lion's throat, feeling the blade scrape against bone as the great cat twisted away from the killing stroke. His own blood was flowing freely now, soaking through his heavy canvas pants and pooling on the forest floor. The mountain lion's claws had found the large artery in his thigh, and he could feel his strength ebbing with each heartbeat. But still he fought, knowing that even a wounded mountain lion could kill an unarmed woman with casual ease. "Get back," he shouted to Eliza, though his voice was strained with pain and effort. "Find Samuel, get the rifle." But Eliza couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but watch in horrified fascination as this stranger, this man she had met only hours before, fought a creature of nightmare to save her life. She saw the exact moment when the mountain lion's claws found something vital in Wyatt's leg, saw his face go pale with shock and blood loss, saw him realize what the injury meant even as he continued to fight. The end came suddenly. Wyatt's knife, guided by desperation and the kind of luck that sometimes favors the brave, found its mark between the mountain lion's ribs. The great cat convulsed once, its claws raking one final devastating furrow down Wyatt's leg, and then went limp. In the sudden silence that followed, Eliza could hear nothing but Wyatt's labored breathing and the distant sound of Samuel Torres crashing through the underbrush, drawn by the sounds of battle. She looked down at the man who had saved her life and saw immediately that his sacrifice had cost him dearly. Wyatt's left leg was mangled beyond recognition, the heavy bone visible through torn flesh and canvas. Blood continued to flow steadily, and his face had gone the color of old parchment. When he tried to move, to reassure himself that he was still alive, nothing happened below the knee. The mountain lion's final swipe had severed something that could never be repaired. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you need to take my bandana and tie it tight around my leg, above the worst of the damage, tight as you can manage." With shaking hands, Eliza untied the red silk scarf from around her neck. It seemed impossibly delicate for such a terrible purpose, but it was all they had. As she wound it around Wyatt's thigh and pulled it tight, the bright fabric darkened with his blood, becoming a crimson symbol of sacrifice that would forever bind their fates together. Samuel Torres burst into the clearing, rifle in hand, just as Eliza was securing the improvised tourniquet. Behind him came Mrs. Whitman, who took one look at the scene and promptly fainted. "Jesus Christ," Samuel breathed, staring at the dead mountain lion and the man who had killed it. "Mister, that was the bravest thing I've ever seen." But Wyatt wasn't listening to praise. He was looking at his ruined leg and making the calculations that any frontier man learned to make when faced with serious injury. The leg was destroyed, even if they could get him to a doctor, and that was a big if, given their remote location. Amputation would be the only option. "Samuel," he said quietly, "you're going to need to take it off." The guide's face went white. "Now? Here? Has to be done, and sooner is better than later. The longer we wait, the more likely infection becomes." Wyatt's voice was steady, but Eliza could see the fear in his eyes, not fear of pain, but fear of what life would be like for a one-legged cowboy in a world that demanded physical perfection for survival. As Samuel Torres prepared for the grimmest task of his guiding career, Eliza knelt beside Wyatt and took his hand in hers. She didn't know why she did it, only that this man had given everything to save her life, and the least she could do was ensure he didn't face the ordeal alone. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Wyatt Morgan, ma'am. I'm Eliza Hartford, and I promise you won't be alone through this." He squeezed her hand weakly. "Might want to look away for what comes next." But Eliza Hartford, daughter of railroad barons and product of Denver's finest finishing schools, surprised them all by staying exactly where she was. The ornate silver medical kit had been a wedding gift to Eliza's mother 25 years earlier, a delicate thing designed more for treating headaches and minor cuts than the brutal realities of frontier medicine. But as Samuel Torres prepared his knife over the fire, sterilizing the blade with whiskey and flame, Eliza found herself carefully examining each instrument with new purpose. The tiny scissors, the roll of fine cotton bandages, the small bottles of laudanum and carbolic acid, all of it would be needed in the hours to come. Wyatt had lost consciousness during the amputation, which Samuel considered a mercy. The guide's hands had been steady despite the terrible nature of the task, and he'd worked with the efficiency of a man who understood that hesitation would only prolong suffering. When it was finished, when the ruined portion of Wyatt's leg had been cleanly removed just below the knee, Eliza had taken charge of the bandaging with a competence that surprised even herself. Miss Hartford, Mrs. Whitman had protested weakly from her position against a tree trunk where she'd been deposited after her fainting spell. "This is hardly appropriate for a young lady of your standing." But Eliza had ignored her chaperone's objections, focused entirely on the pale, unconscious man whose life now hung in the balance. She'd cleaned the wound with carbolic acid, applied the pressure bandages exactly as Samuel had instructed, and settled herself beside Wyatt to begin the long vigil that would determine whether her presence would be a comfort or a burden in the days ahead. They had carried him to an abandoned mining cabin that Samuel remembered from previous expeditions, a sturdy log structure that had been built to weather mountain storms and was now pressed into service as a makeshift hospital. The single room contained little more than a stone fireplace, a crude wooden table, and sleeping platforms built into the walls, but it offered shelter and the kind of isolation that serious injuries required. For 3 days, Wyatt had burned with fever, while infection fought with his body's natural defenses. Eliza had barely left his side, sponging his face with cool water, forcing small amounts of broth between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow, and listening to the delirious words that escaped him during the worst of his suffering. In those fevered ramblings, she learned more about Wyatt Morgan than any formal introduction could have provided. He spoke of his father's death at Gettysburg, of losing the family farm to drought and creditors, of long cattle drives and lonely nights spent under vast prairie skies. But he also spoke of dreams, a small ranch of his own someday, maybe a family, the simple satisfaction of building something lasting with his own hands. "You don't have to stay," he had told her during one of his lucid moments, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your people will be looking for you. A woman like you shouldn't be." "A woman like me?" Eliza had interrupted gently. "What kind of woman do you think I am, Mr. Morgan?" He'd studied her face with eyes that still held fever's brightness. "The kind who deserves better than tending to a broken-down cowboy in a place like this." But Eliza had continued her vigil, discovering reserves of strength and determination she'd never known she possessed. She learned to build up the fire, to prepare simple meals from their dwindling supplies, to change bandages without flinching at the sight of the healing wound. Mrs. Whitman had taken to her bed with what she called nervous exhaustion, leaving the practical work to Samuel and Eliza. On the 4th morning, Wyatt's fever finally broke. Eliza woke from an uneasy sleep in the chair beside his bed to find him watching her with clear, rational eyes. The crisis had passed, but they both understood that the worst challenges still lay ahead. "How long?" he asked, his voice hoarse from days of delirium. 4 days, Eliza replied, moving to bring him water. "Samuel says the worst of the infection has passed." Wyatt tried to sit up, then fell back with a grimace as his new reality asserted itself. The weight of the blankets told him everything he needed to know about what remained of his left leg. He closed his eyes for a moment, and Eliza saw him make the internal adjustment that would define the rest of his life. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "Sorry? For what?" For putting you through this, for making you see." He gestured toward his bandaged leg. "A lady shouldn't have to deal with such things." Eliza felt a flare of something she'd never experienced before, a protective anger on behalf of this man who apologized for being hurt while saving her life. "Mr. Morgan, you threw yourself at a mountain lion to save me. The only thing I'm sorry about is that you paid such a price for my foolishness." "Wasn't foolishness," Wyatt said quietly. "Just bad luck. Could have happened to anyone." But they both knew that wasn't true. The attack had happened because Eliza had wandered away from the group, drawn by curiosity and a restless need for adventure that her sheltered upbringing had only intensified. She carried that knowledge like a weight, understanding that Wyatt's sacrifice had saved her life, but forever changed his. Samuel Torres entered the cabin carrying an armload of firewood, his relief evident when he saw Wyatt awake and coherent. "About time you rejoined the living," the guide said with forced cheerfulness. "Was starting to worry we'd have to carry you out of here feet first." "Still might," Wyatt replied. "How long before we can travel?" Samuel's expression grew serious. "That depends on what you mean by travel. You're in no condition for horseback, and we're a long way from anywhere that has a proper doctor." "What about getting word to my father?" Eliza asked. "He could send men, a wagon." "Miss Hartford," Wyatt interrupted gently. "Your father doesn't know me from Adam. Why would he send help for a stranger?" The question hung in the air, highlighting the social gulf that separated them. Jonathan Hartford might send a reward for his daughter's rescue, but the ongoing care of a disabled cowboy would hardly be his concern. Wyatt would be expected to manage his own affairs, to find his own way, in a world that had little patience for men who couldn't pull their own weight. "Then we wait," Eliza said firmly, "until you're strong enough to travel safely." "Ma'am, you can't. Your reputation, your family, will survive my extended absence," she finished. "I've sent word through Samuel that we encountered difficulties and need additional time. My father will assume we're simply taking a more leisurely pace." It was a lie, and they all knew it. Each day that passed, without word from the expedition, would increase the worry and eventual search efforts. But Eliza had made her decision with the same determination that had kept her at Wyatt's bedside through the worst of his fever. Over the following days, as Wyatt's strength slowly returned, they settled into a routine that would have been unthinkable under any other circumstances. Eliza proved surprisingly adept at practical tasks, cooking simple meals, maintaining the fire, even helping Wyatt with the exercises Samuel recommended to strengthen his remaining leg muscles. She watched him struggle with the most basic tasks, saw the frustration in his eyes when he tried to stand and nearly fell, witnessed the moment when he carved his first crude crutch from a piece of pine and took his first halting steps across the cabin floor. There was something profound in seeing a man rebuild himself from such devastating loss, and Eliza found herself changed by the experience in ways she couldn't yet fully understand. "You don't have to do this," Wyatt told her one evening as she helped him practice walking with the makeshift crutch. "Taking care of an invalid isn't what you signed up for when you left Denver." Eliza paused in her encouragement, studying his face in the firelight. "And what did I sign up for, do you think?" "I don't know. Adventure, maybe. A chance to see the country before settling down to—" He stopped, realizing he was presuming to know her circumstances. "Before settling down to marry Marcus Thornfield and producing the appropriate number of heirs to continue both family lines?" Eliza's voice held a bitterness that surprised them both. Yes, that was the plan. For the first time since the attack, they were talking about the future that waited beyond this isolated cabin, and both of them felt the weight of obligations and expectations that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The wooden crutch that Wyatt carved from a straight piece of pine became more than just a walking aid. It represented his refusal to surrender to circumstances that might have broken a lesser man. He'd spent hours shaping it with his knife, smoothing the rough wood until it fit comfortably under his arm, adding padding from strips torn from his own shirt. Each careful stroke of the blade was an act of defiance against the fate that had tried to reduce him to helplessness. Watching him work on that crutch, Eliza had felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of strength that had nothing to do with physical wholeness. In Denver society, she'd been surrounded by men who defined themselves by their possessions, their social connections, their ability to control circumstances through wealth and influence. But here was a man rebuilding himself with nothing but determination and a piece of mountain pine. "Tell me about your ranch," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, Wyatt whittling adjustments to his crutch while she mended a tear in her riding skirt. It was their 8th day in the cabin, and the simple domestic routine had created an intimacy that neither had expected. Wyatt paused in his work, his knife stilling against the smooth wood. "What ranch?" "The one you talked about during your fever. You said you wanted a small place of your own someday." He was quiet for so long that Eliza thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of dreams that seemed increasingly impossible. "Used to think about it. Nothing grand, just enough land for a few head of cattle, maybe some horses. A cabin with a real floor and windows that kept out the wind. Used to think about it." Wyatt gestured toward his bandaged leg. "Hard to run a ranch when you can barely walk. Cattle don't wait for a man to catch up on crutches." "There are other ways to work with animals," Eliza said quietly. "My father's railroad employs men who've lost limbs in accidents. They find other roles, other ways to contribute. Your father's railroad can afford charity. A small ranch needs every man to pull his weight." The bitterness in his voice was new, and it troubled Eliza more than she cared to admit. She'd watched him fight through pain and infection with remarkable courage, but this loss of hope seemed more dangerous than any physical injury. "It's not charity if a man earns his keep," she said. "You know more about horses and cattle than most men ever will. That knowledge doesn't disappear because you've lost part of a leg." Wyatt looked up from his crutch, studying her face in the firelight. "You really believe that? I've watched you these past days. I've seen how you handle horses, how you read the weather, how you understand this country in ways that city people never could. A disability doesn't erase a lifetime of experience." Something in her tone made him set down his knife entirely. "You sound like you've given this considerable thought." Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had been thinking about Wyatt's future, about what would happen when they finally returned to civilization, about possibilities that she had no right to consider. "I just think it would be a waste for you to give up on your dreams because of one terrible day." "And what about your dreams?" Wyatt asked. What did Eliza Hartford want before she ended up playing nursemaid to a broken cowboy? The question caught her off guard, partly because no one had ever asked it before. Her life had been planned in careful detail since childhood: the right schools, the right social connections, the right marriage to consolidate family fortunes. Dreams had been a luxury she'd never been encouraged to pursue. "I wanted to see the world," she said finally. "To travel, to experience things beyond Denver drawing rooms and charity committees. I wanted to understand what lay beyond the comfortable boundaries of my father's wealth. And now I've seen what real courage looks like. I've learned that I'm stronger than anyone believed, including myself. I've discovered that the most important things in life can't be bought or arranged by well-meaning parents." They sat in silence for a while, both aware that they were approaching dangerous territory. The gulf between their social positions remained as vast as ever, but their shared ordeal had created a bond that transcended conventional boundaries. "Your family will be worried," Wyatt said eventually. "Samuel sent word, but they'll expect you back soon. Samuel can send another message. We're perfectly safe here, and you're not ready for a difficult journey. Eliza." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it sent an unexpected warmth through her. "You can't stay here indefinitely. You have obligations, responsibilities. So do you. You have an obligation to heal properly, to give yourself the best chance at a normal life. This is my normal life now, Wyatt said, touching his injured leg. A one-legged cowboy with no prospects and no future. That's not something a woman like you should concern herself with. Eliza stood abruptly, her mending falling to the floor. Stop saying that. Stop defining yourself by what you've lost, instead of what you still have. The passion in her voice surprised them both. Wyatt stared up at her, seeing something in her face that he'd never expected to see directed at him, genuine care, perhaps even something deeper. You don't understand, he said quietly. In your world, people adapt to circumstances like this because they have resources, options. In my world, a man who can't do the work gets left behind. Then maybe it's time to consider a different world, Eliza said, then immediately regretted the words. They implied things that couldn't be spoken, possibilities that existed only in the strange isolation of this mountain cabin. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. What are you saying? I'm saying that the past 10 days have taught me more about life than the previous 24 years combined. I'm saying that I've watched you rebuild yourself with nothing but determination and pine wood, and I think you're capable of rebuilding anything you set your mind to, including a ranch. He picked up his crutch and stood, testing his balance on the rough wooden floor. Each day brought improvement, each small success building toward the larger goal of mobility. But Eliza could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the way he still flinched slightly when putting weight on his good leg, afraid that it too might fail him. There's something else, she said softly, something I need to tell you about my situation in Denver. Wyatt sensed the shift in her tone, the way her voice carried new weight. What is it? I'm engaged to be married, have been for 6 months. The announcement was made before I left for this expedition. The words hung between them like a physical barrier. Wyatt felt something cold settle in his chest, though he told himself he had no right to such feelings. Of course, she was engaged. Women of her station didn't remain unattached for long, especially when family fortunes were involved. I see, he said carefully. He's a fortunate man. Marcus Thornfield. He owns several mines in the territory, some real estate in Denver. My father considers it an excellent match. And you? Eliza was quiet for so long that Wyatt thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I've never felt for Marcus what I... She stopped, catching herself before crossing a line they both knew existed. I've never felt that our engagement was about anything more than business convenience. The admission created a tension in the small cabin that neither knew how to address. They were moving into territory that could change everything between them, and both understood the dangers inherent in such honesty. On the wall beside the fireplace, carved deep into the weathered logs by some long-forgotten prospector, was a compass rose, its 8 points radiating outward like a map of all the directions a life might take. Eliza found herself staring at it often during the quiet moments between tending to Wyatt and managing their simple household, wondering which direction her own life would take when they finally left this isolated sanctuary. The compass rose seemed to mock the careful plans that had been made for her future. True north led back to Denver, to Marcus Thornfield, and a marriage arranged for business rather than affection. But the other directions, east, west, south, all seemed to whisper of possibilities that had never been presented to her before. This mountain cabin became the center of her world. Wyatt had been watching her study the carving, noting how her fingers sometimes traced the points while she thought he wasn't looking. He understood that restlessness, that sense of standing at a crossroads where every choice carried weight that couldn't be undone. The man who carved that probably felt the same way you do, he said one morning as she prepared their simple breakfast of coffee and hardtack, wondering which way to go, what life might be waiting in each direction. Eliza paused in her work, her hand still holding the coffee pot above the fire. How do you know what I'm thinking? Same way you knew I was dreaming about a ranch of my own. When people spend this much time together in circumstances like these, they start to see past the polite surfaces. She set down the coffee pot and turned to face him. Over the past 2 weeks, their morning routine had become as natural as breathing. She would wake first and stoke the fire. He would lever himself upright and test his strength with a few steps around the cabin, and they would share the simple meal that had become more meaningful than any formal dinner she'd ever attended in Denver. "And what do you see when you look past my polite surface?" she asked. Wyatt considered the question carefully. Honesty had become their currency in this place, worth more than any social pleasantries or careful deflections. "I see a woman who's stronger than she ever knew, braver than anyone gave her credit for, and trapped in a life that was designed by other people for their own purposes." The words struck closer to truth than Eliza had expected. She'd spent so many years accepting her predetermined path that she'd almost forgotten it was possible to choose differently. "And what do you see when you look at yourself?" she asked. "A man who lost more than his leg in that fight with the mountain lion, lost his sense of who he was, what he was worth." He gestured toward his crutch, which leaned against the wall within easy reach. "Hard to see yourself as capable when you need a piece of pine just to walk across a room." "Then you're not looking clearly," Eliza said with surprising firmness. "I've watched you adapt to circumstances that would have broken most men. I've seen you solve problems, take care of yourself, even take care of me when I was too frightened to think straight." She moved closer, close enough that he could see the earnestness in her dark eyes. "Do you know what I was most afraid of when that mountain lion attacked? Dying, I'd imagine. No. I was afraid of living my entire life without ever being tested, without ever knowing if I had any real strength beneath all the careful polish my family spent so much money creating." The confession hung between them, carrying implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. But the truth of it was undeniable. The past 2 weeks had stripped away pretenses and revealed core truths about both their characters. "You've been tested now," Wyatt said quietly. "You passed with flying colors. So have you. Every day, every time you refuse to feel sorry for yourself or give up on the future. That's not the response of a broken man." They were standing close enough now that Eliza could see the flecks of gold in Wyatt's brown eyes, could smell the scent of pine sap and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. There was something building between them that went far beyond gratitude or proximity, a recognition that perhaps they had found in each other something that neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed. "Eliza," he said, her name carrying new weight when spoken so softly. "We need to talk about what happens when we leave here." "Do we?" She could hear the slight tremor in her own voice. "Can't we just exist in this moment a little longer?" "We could. But it wouldn't be fair to either of us. You have obligations waiting in Denver. I have—" He paused, realizing that his future remained an open question. "I have a life to rebuild somehow. What if those obligations aren't as binding as we think? What if there are other possibilities?" Wyatt felt his heart speed up at the suggestion in her voice. But years of hard living had taught him to be wary of dreams that seemed too good to be true. "Like what?" "Like two people who've learned they're stronger together than either was alone. Like choosing a direction that wasn't planned by fathers or social expectations or business arrangements." She was close enough now that he could have reached out and touched her face, could have drawn her closer and acknowledged what had been growing between them since that first terrible day. But the weight of their different circumstances held him back. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're Marcus Thornfield's intended bride. You're Jonathan Hartford's daughter. I'm a disabled cowboy with no prospects and no future to offer anyone. You're the man who threw himself at a mountain lion to save my life," Eliza said firmly. "You're someone who carves hope out of pine wood and refuses to surrender to circumstances that would defeat most people. You're—" She stopped herself, aware that she was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But the words hung in the air between them, as clear as if she'd spoken them aloud. "You're the man I've fallen in love with." Wyatt saw the truth in her eyes, felt it echoing in his own chest, like an answer to a question he'd been afraid to ask. But understanding the feelings and acting on them were different things entirely. "This place isn't the real world," he said, though the words seemed to cost him considerable effort. "Up here, cut off from everything else, it's easy to think that circumstances don't matter, but they do. They always do." "Then maybe it's time to change the circumstances," Eliza said. "Maybe it's time to choose a different direction entirely." Her eyes moved to the compass rose, carved into the cabin wall, with its 8 points representing 8 different ways forward. True north led back to Denver and Marcus Thornfield. But the other directions, all the other directions, remained unexplored territory where anything might be possible. Outside the cabin, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, dusting the pine trees with white and transforming the mountain landscape into something pristine and new. Winter was coming to the high country, and with it, the need to make decisions that had been postponed too long already. But for now, in the warmth of their small sanctuary, two people stood facing each other with the kind of honesty that most never found, seeing clearly not just who they were, but who they might become if they had the courage to choose love over duty, hope over security, and an uncertain future together over the safe, predetermined paths that others had laid out for them. The engagement ring felt heavier on Eliza's finger with each passing day, its diamond catching the firelight like a glittering reminder of promises made on her behalf without consulting her heart. Marcus Thornfield had presented it to her 6 months ago in her father's study, with all the ceremony of a business transaction, which, she now realized, was exactly what it had been. She found herself twisting the band absently while watching Wyatt practice walking with his crutch, each small success bringing him closer to the independence he'd thought lost forever. The ring had once represented security, social standing, and her family's approval. Now it felt like a shackle binding her to a life that seemed increasingly foreign, with each day spent in this simple cabin. "You're quiet this morning," Wyatt observed, settling carefully onto the bench he'd fashioned from split logs. His mobility improved daily, but he still moved with the deliberate care of a man learning to trust his body again. "Just thinking," Eliza replied, unconsciously covering the ring with her other hand. "About Denver? About choices. About the difference between what we think we want and what we actually need." Wyatt followed her gaze to where the ring had been, noting how she'd hidden it from view. He'd wondered about her engagement more than once, though he'd tried to keep such thoughts to himself. The question of Marcus Thornfield hung between them like a third presence in the cabin, unspoken but always there. "Tell me about him," he said quietly. "You're intended." Eliza was quiet for so long that Wyatt thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no warmth, no affection, only the resigned tone of someone describing a business arrangement. "Marcus is everything my father considers appropriate in a son-in-law. Wealthy, connected, ambitious. He owns 3 silver mines and considerable property in Denver. The marriage will unite 2 of Colorado's most prominent families." "And what do you consider appropriate in a husband?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her opinion about the qualities she might want in a life partner. The match with Marcus had been presented as inevitable, a natural progression of social expectations, rather than a choice requiring her input. "I used to think it didn't matter," she admitted. "I was raised to believe that affection would grow from respect and shared circumstances. That love was a luxury that sensible people couldn't afford to prioritize." "Used to think?" Eliza stood and moved to the small window, looking out at the snow-covered peaks that surrounded their sanctuary. "These past weeks have shown me what it feels like to genuinely care about someone's welfare, to have your happiness tied to another person's well-being. I never felt that with Marcus. I'm not sure he's capable of inspiring such feelings." Wyatt felt something tighten in his chest at her words. The careful distance he'd tried to maintain was becoming impossible to sustain when she spoke with such honesty about emotions that mirrored his own. "Eliza," he said, her name carrying new weight when spoken so softly, "you can't be thinking we can't." "Can't what?" She turned from the window to face him directly. "Can't acknowledge what's been growing between us? Can't admit that this time together has changed us both in ways we never expected? Can't pretend that feelings change circumstances," Wyatt said, though the words seemed to cost him considerable effort. "You're promised to another man. Your family has expectations. My future remains uncertain, at best." "Your future is what you make of it," Eliza said firmly, "and my promises were made by other people for reasons that have nothing to do with what I've learned about myself these past weeks." She moved closer, close enough that he could see the determination in her dark eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly with the courage it took to speak such truths aloud. "I've never felt for Marcus what I feel for you," she said quietly. "I've never felt that my heart might break if something happened to him. I've never lost sleep wondering if he was in pain, never felt that my own happiness depended on his welfare." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Wyatt felt his carefully maintained resolve wavering in the face of her honesty. "You don't understand what you're saying," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'm a disabled cowboy with no money, no prospects, no way to provide the kind of life you're accustomed to. The kind of life I'm accustomed to nearly suffocated me," Eliza replied. "These weeks with you, living simply, caring for each other, this has been more real, more meaningful than anything I experienced in 24 years of privilege." She knelt beside his bench, her hands covering his work-roughened fingers. The engagement ring caught the light between them, a glittering reminder of the complications that waited beyond their mountain refuge. "I love you," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I know it's impossible, I know it complicates everything, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't tell you." Wyatt stared down at their joined hands, seeing the contrast between her soft skin and his calloused palms, between the expensive ring that represented her predetermined future and the simple honesty of the moment they were sharing. "I love you too," he said finally, the admission seeming to surprise him as much as it did her. "God help me, I've loved you since that first day, when you refused to look away while Samuel took my leg. I've loved watching you discover your own strength, loved the way you see possibilities where others see only problems." The words hung in the air between them, transforming everything and changing nothing. Love existed independent of circumstances, but circumstances still held the power to destroy even the strongest feelings. "So what do we do?" Eliza asked. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. "I don't know. In my world, love doesn't conquer practical realities. Your family will never accept me. Marcus Thornfield won't simply step aside. And he gestured toward his injured leg. "I don't even know if I can support myself, much less provide for a wife." "Then we figure it out together," Eliza said with surprising firmness. "We find a way to make love triumph over circumstances." Wyatt looked into her eyes and saw the same determination that had sustained her through his darkest hours of fever and pain. Perhaps, he thought, love combined with that kind of stubborn courage might indeed find a way to overcome the obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Outside their small sanctuary, the snow continued to fall, covering the mountain world in pristine white and making their eventual return to civilization seem both inevitable and impossibly distant. But inside the cabin, two people had finally acknowledged the truth that had been growing between them, a love strong enough to challenge every assumption about their predetermined futures. Eliza slowly twisted the engagement ring from her finger, holding it up to catch the firelight one last time before setting it aside on the rough wooden table. The gesture was simple but profound, a symbolic rejection of one future in favor of another that remained uncertain but infinitely more authentic. "Whatever happens when we leave here," she said. "I want you to know that these have been the most honest, most meaningful weeks of my life." Wyatt reached for her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek with infinite gentleness. "Mine too. Whatever the future holds, we'll face it together." The kiss that followed was tender and profound, carrying the weight of love acknowledged, and the promise of courage to face whatever challenges their choice might bring. The forged letter arrived 3 days after the first heavy snow, carried by a rider who claimed to represent the Hartford family's urgent concerns. Samuel Torres accepted the sealed envelope with obvious relief after nearly 3 weeks of isolation. Any word from the outside world seemed like deliverance from an increasingly complicated situation. "Miss Hartford," he called, his voice carrying new authority as he approached the cabin. "Word from your father." Eliza emerged from where she'd been helping Wyatt practice walking on the increasingly treacherous ground outside their shelter. Her heart sank at the sight of her father's familiar seal, knowing that whatever the letter contained would shatter the fragile peace they'd built in their mountain sanctuary. She broke the wax with trembling fingers, aware that Wyatt was watching her face for any sign of what the message might contain. As she read, her expression shifted from anxiety to confusion to something approaching horror. "What is it?" Wyatt asked, moving closer despite the difficulty of navigating the snow-covered ground with his crutch. "My father," Eliza's voice caught, and she had to clear her throat before continuing. "My father says he's received word that I've been compromised by prolonged contact with unsuitable companions. He's disowning me unless I return immediately and marry Marcus within the month." The letter trembled in her hands as she read the harsh words that seemed so unlike her father's usual measured tone. According to the message, rumors had reached Denver about her extended absence in the company of a disabled cowboy, and the scandal threatened to destroy not only her reputation but the family's social standing. "He says Marcus has been generous enough to overlook my indiscretions, but only if I agree to an immediate wedding that will put an end to gossip and speculation." Wyatt felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Let me see that." She handed him the letter, watching his face as he read the words that seemed designed to crush any hope they might have harbored for a future together. But instead of the resignation she expected, Wyatt's expression grew increasingly skeptical. "This doesn't sound like your father," he said finally. "What do you mean? You've talked about him often these past weeks. Described him as a stern but fair man who loves you deeply. He gestured toward the letter. "This sounds like someone trying to manipulate you through fear and urgency." Eliza took the letter back, reading it again with new attention to details she'd missed in her initial shock. The handwriting was correct, the seal authentic, but something about the tone felt wrong, too harsh, too final, lacking the underlying affection that had always tempered her father's sternest lectures. "Who brought this?" she asked Samuel. "Rider from town. Said he was instructed to wait for a reply." "Did you recognize him?" Samuel frowned, suddenly uncertain. "Can't say I did. But then, your father employs many men I wouldn't know by sight." A new voice cut through their conversation, a smooth, cultured tone that carried authority and barely concealed satisfaction. "Actually, the messenger works for me." They turned to see Marcus Thornfield emerging from the tree line, leading a small party of men that included Eliza's father and several armed riders. Marcus rode with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his plans work exactly as intended, his expensive clothes and well-groomed appearance a stark contrast to the rough mountain setting. Eliza felt her heart sink as she recognized the cold calculation in her fiancé's eyes. This wasn't a rescue mission motivated by concern for her welfare. It was something far more deliberate and potentially dangerous. "Marcus," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "what are you doing here?" "Saving you from a situation that threatens to destroy everything your family has worked to build," he replied, dismounting with practiced ease. Though I must say, your taste in companions has proven even more questionable than I feared." Jonathan Hartford approached his daughter with obvious relief, but Eliza could see the strain in his face, the way his eyes darted nervously toward Marcus, as if seeking approval for his actions. "Eliza, thank God you're safe," her father said, embracing her with genuine warmth. "When word reached us about your extended absence, about the circumstances—" "What circumstances?" Eliza interrupted. "What exactly have you been told?" Marcus stepped forward, his smile holding no warmth. "That you've been living in isolation with a disabled drifter, playing at being his nurse while your reputation suffers irreparable damage. That you've been so traumatized by your ordeal that you've lost sight of your obligations and responsibilities. That's not— The details don't matter," Marcus continued smoothly. "What matters is containing the damage before it spreads further. Fortunately, I've managed to convince Denver society that your extended absence was due to illness rather than unseemly attachments." Wyatt had been silent during this exchange, leaning heavily on his crutch while assessing the newcomers with the careful eye of a man who recognized danger when he saw it. Something about Marcus Thornfield's manner set off every instinct honed by years of frontier living. "Eliza," Wyatt said quietly, "step away from him." Marcus's laugh held genuine amusement. How touching! The crippled hero thinks he can protect his lady love from the consequences of her poor judgment. The word "crippled" hung in the air like a physical blow, and Eliza felt rage flare in her chest at the casual cruelty of it. "Marcus, you will not speak to him that way." "I'll speak to him however I choose," Marcus replied, his pleasant mask slipping slightly. "He's a nobody who took advantage of a vulnerable woman in traumatic circumstances. The fact that you've developed some misguided attachment to him only proves how badly this situation has affected your judgment." Jonathan Hartford looked increasingly uncomfortable with the tone of the conversation. "Perhaps we should focus on getting Eliza to safety and discussing the details later." "The details need to be discussed now," Marcus said firmly, "before any more damage is done to your daughter's reputation or your family's standing in the community." He turned to face Wyatt directly, his expression hardening. "You've had your adventure, Cowboy. You've played the hero and enjoyed the gratitude of a woman far above your station. But the game is over now. It's time for everyone to return to their proper places." "And if I refuse to play along with your version of events?" Wyatt asked, his voice deceptively calm. Marcus's smile returned, but it carried no warmth. "Then you'll discover how difficult life can become for a disabled man with no resources and no allies. There are many remote places in these mountains where a one-legged cowboy might meet with an unfortunate accident." The threat was delivered with such casual confidence that it left no doubt about Marcus's willingness to follow through. Eliza felt ice form in her veins as she realized the true nature of the man she'd been expected to marry. "You're threatening to kill him?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm explaining the natural consequences of poor decision-making," Marcus replied. "Your cowboy friend has two choices: disappear quietly and never contact you again, or face the unfortunate realities of life as a disabled man who's made powerful enemies." Jonathan Hartford's face had gone pale during this exchange. "Marcus, surely there's no need for such extreme measures. If we simply what?" Marcus snapped, his civilized veneer finally cracking completely. "Allow your daughter to throw away everything our families have worked toward for the sake of a romantic fantasy with a crippled nobody." The mask was fully off now, revealing the calculating predator beneath the polished exterior. Eliza saw her father's shocked recognition of Marcus's true nature, saw him realize that his daughter's engagement had been to a man capable of casual violence in pursuit of his goals. "The wedding will take place within the week," Marcus continued, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Eliza will return to Denver immediately, and this unfortunate episode will be forgotten by everyone involved. Those who choose not to forget will face consequences appropriate to their interference. He signaled to his men, who moved to flank Wyatt despite his obvious disability. The message was clear. Resistance would be met with immediate violence. "Father," Eliza said, her voice carrying desperate appeal, "you can't allow this. You can't let him." "Your father understands the necessities of the situation," Marcus said before Jonathan could respond. "He knows that sometimes difficult decisions must be made to protect family interests." But as Eliza looked into her father's eyes, she saw something that gave her hope, a recognition that he'd been manipulated into a situation that went far beyond protecting family reputation. Jonathan Hartford was a hard man, but not a cruel one, and the threat against Wyatt's life had shown him a side of Marcus Thornfield that he couldn't ignore. The forged letter, she realized, had been just the beginning of Marcus's plan to force her compliance through fear and isolation. But his overconfidence had revealed the true depths of his ruthlessness, and in doing so, had potentially given her the allies she needed to fight back. The question now was whether anyone would have the courage to stand against a man who had just demonstrated his willingness to use violence to achieve his goals. The small leather pouch that the Ute elder pressed into Wyatt's hands contained more than medicinal herbs. It held the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned to survive in harsh circumstances through courage, cunning, and the strength that comes from understanding one's true purpose. The old man had appeared like a ghost from the snow-covered forest, moving with the silent grace of someone who belonged to these mountains in ways that white settlers never could. "You are the one who fights the great cat to save the woman," the elder said in careful English, his weathered face studying Wyatt with eyes that seemed to see past surface appearances to something deeper. "The spirits speak of your courage, but they also speak of the darkness that comes for you." Wyatt accepted the pouch with the respect due to someone whose knowledge of these mountains predated any European presence. 3 days had passed since Marcus Thornfield had taken Eliza away. 3 days during which Wyatt had struggled with despair and the growing conviction that his love for her had only brought danger to them both. "What darkness?" he asked. "The one who claims the woman seeks to destroy you, not just defeat you. He has sent men into the mountains, hunters who know these trails. They come not to capture, but to ensure you never return to trouble his plans." The elder's words confirmed what Wyatt had already suspected. Marcus wasn't content with simply separating him from Eliza. He intended to eliminate any possibility of future interference by removing Wyatt permanently from the equation. "The woman," the elder continued, "she has the spirit of the eagle, strong and fierce. But she is caged now, held in the place of stone and wood, where the railroad man built his stronghold. The Dark One keeps her there, tells others she is sick with mountain fever, needs rest before the binding ceremony. You've seen her? My grandson works in the stables there. He says the woman refuses food, refuses to speak with her captors. She waits, like the eagle waits for the right wind to carry her to freedom." The elder opened the leather pouch, revealing an assortment of roots, dried leaves, and what appeared to be strips of bark. "For strength," he said, pointing to each item in turn. "For healing, for clear sight when the mind is clouded by pain or fear. Why are you helping me?" The old man was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving to Wyatt's injured leg. "Because you gave your body to save another, asking nothing in return. Because the spirits have shown me that your path leads toward justice, not just for yourself, but for others who suffer under the Dark One's power. Others? The railroad man has a good heart, but weak will when faced with threats to his child. The Dark One has convinced him that cooperation is the only way to keep the woman safe. But there are those in his household who see the truth, who wait for someone with courage to stand against the lies." The elder stood to leave, moving with the fluid grace of someone decades younger. "3 others come this way, men who knew you in the time before your injury. They seek to help, but the hunters will find them first, unless you act quickly." "Where?" "The narrow pass, where the creek runs between tall stones. The hunters wait there like wolves, patient and hungry. After the elder disappeared back into the forest, Wyatt spent the remainder of the day preparing for what he knew would be the most important fight of his life. The medicinal herbs provided clarity and strength he hadn't felt since before the mountain lion attack, but he understood that this battle would be won through strategy and determination rather than physical prowess. Samuel Torres had been the first to offer help, arriving at the cabin with supplies and information about Marcus's movements. The guide's weathered face carried guilt over his failure to protect Eliza from the forces that had torn her away from their mountain sanctuary. "I should have seen it coming," Samuel said as they planned their approach to the Hartford estate. "Should have known that a man like Thornfield wouldn't simply accept defeat." "You couldn't have known," Wyatt replied, checking the loads in the rifle Samuel had brought. "Men like Marcus are skilled at hiding their true nature until they feel secure enough to reveal it." The two other men who had come to help were cowboys Wyatt had worked with during previous cattle drives, Jake Morrison and Tom Stevens, both solid men who understood that some fights were worth taking regardless of the odds. "Heard you tangled with a mountain lion and came out on the short end," Jake said, with the sort of rough affection that passed for sympathy among men who lived dangerous lives. "Also heard you did it to save a lady, which makes you either the bravest fool or the most foolish brave man I've ever known." "Probably both," Wyatt admitted. "But I can't let her pay the price for my feelings." Tom Stevens, a man of few words but considerable action, simply nodded and began checking his weapons. In his mind, the situation was simple. A woman was being held against her will by a man who threatened violence against anyone who interfered. Such situations called for direct action rather than lengthy discussion. The plan they developed was necessarily complex, given Wyatt's limited mobility and the need to overcome both Marcus's hired guns and the isolation of the Hartford estate. They would need to create multiple distractions, divide their enemy's attention, and find a way to reach Eliza before Marcus could carry out his threat to marry her immediately. "The estate sits on a plateau about 15 miles from here," Samuel explained, sketching a rough map in the dirt. "Only 2 approaches the main road from town and a narrow trail that comes up from the backside of the mountain. Marcus has men watching both routes." "What about the house itself?" "Big stone structure, built like a fortress because Jonathan Hartford never forgot that this is still wild country. Multiple entrances, but most of them will be guarded now that Marcus has taken control." Wyatt studied the crude map, noting the advantages and disadvantages of each approach. "What about allies inside?" The elder mentioned people who might help. "Cook named Maria Santos, been with the family for years. Couple of stable hands who don't like what they're seeing. But they're all afraid to act openly. Marcus has made it clear that disloyalty will be punished severely." The first phase of their plan required dealing with the hunters Marcus had sent to eliminate Wyatt. According to the Ute elder's intelligence, 3 men waited in the narrow pass, positioned to ambush anyone attempting to reach the estate from the back trail. "I'll take point," Jake volunteered. "Draw their attention while you circle around." "No," Wyatt said firmly. "This is my fight. I won't have other men dying for my choices." "With respect," Tom Stevens spoke up, "this stopped being just your fight when that bastard started threatening innocent people and corrupting the legal system to get what he wants." The truth of that statement was undeniable. Marcus's actions had revealed him as the sort of predator who would continue to hurt people until someone stopped him permanently. This wasn't just about rescuing Eliza, it was about preventing future victims from suffering under his particular brand of civilized brutality. They set out before dawn, moving through the snow-covered forest, with the careful silence of men who understood that detection meant death. Wyatt's progress was slower than his companions, but the Ute medicine had strengthened him beyond what he'd thought possible, and determination carried him through terrain that would have been challenging even for an uninjured man. The narrow pass was exactly as the elder had described, a bottleneck between towering rock walls, where the creek had carved a passage through the mountain. It was perfect terrain for an ambush, offering concealment for attackers and no escape routes for victims. The 3 hunters Marcus had hired were professionals, but they'd made the mistake of assuming their target would be a lone, disabled man, desperate enough to attempt a direct assault. They weren't prepared for a coordinated attack by 4 men who understood mountain warfare and had nothing left to lose. The fight was brief but decisive. When it was over, Marcus's hunters lay dead in the snow, their weapons claimed by the men they'd been sent to kill. More importantly, searching their bodies revealed detailed plans for the forced wedding ceremony and the subsequent accident that would eliminate Wyatt permanently. "Tonight," Samuel said, reading from papers found in the lead hunter's coat. "Marcus plans to marry her tonight, before anyone in Denver can raise legal objections or demand proof of her consent." "Then we move now," Wyatt said, accepting the rifle Jake handed him. "Whatever happens, we make sure that wedding doesn't take place." As they prepared for the final assault on the Hartford estate, Wyatt thought about the woman who had changed his life so completely in such a short time. Eliza had taught him that love could make even broken men whole, that courage could overcome circumstances that seemed impossible to change. Now it was time to prove that such lessons worked both ways, that a man who had been saved by love could find the strength to save love in return, regardless of the odds or the price such salvation might require. The medicine bundle the Ute elder had given him seemed to pulse with warmth against his chest, a reminder that some battles were fought not just with weapons and strategy, but with the kind of spiritual strength that came from knowing you were fighting for something larger than yourself. Behind him, 3 good men prepared to risk their lives for a cause that was fundamentally about the right to choose love over power, hope over fear, and justice over the kind of civilized corruption that destroyed lives while maintaining respectable appearances. Ahead lay the most dangerous fight of his life, against an enemy who commanded superior numbers and held every apparent advantage. But Wyatt Morgan had learned something important during his weeks in the mountain cabin. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from strength or advantage, but from the simple refusal to surrender what mattered most, no matter what the cost might be. The silver-handled pistol had been Jonathan Hartford's father's weapon, carried during the early days of railroad construction, when bandits and hostile tribes made every mile of track a victory, earned through blood and determination. Now it lay heavy in Jonathan's trembling hands as he finally understood the true nature of the man he'd welcomed into his family, the monster he'd helped place in a position to destroy his daughter's life. "Marcus, this has gone far enough," Jonathan said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Eliza will not be forced into marriage against her will, and I will not be party to threats of violence against innocent men." They stood in the main hall of the Hartford estate, a grand space built from Colorado granite and furnished with the finest pieces money could import from the East. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a setting for celebration, but tonight it felt more like a courtroom where justice would finally be served. Marcus Thornfield turned from where he'd been directing his men in wedding preparations, his handsome face carrying the sort of cold amusement reserved for those who believed themselves untouchable by conventional consequences. "Jonathan, you disappoint me," Marcus said, adjusting his silk cravat with casual confidence. "I thought you understood the necessities of our situation. Your daughter's reputation hangs by a thread, and only immediate marriage can salvage what remains of your family's social standing. My family's standing was never in danger until you began spreading lies about my daughter's conduct." "Lies?" Marcus's laugh held genuine amusement. "Your precious Eliza spent 3 weeks living in isolation with a crippled drifter, playing house, while decent society wondered what degradations she might be enduring. The truth is far more damaging than any lie I could invent." Jonathan raised the pistol, his hands steadying as righteous anger overcame his natural reluctance to violence. The truth is that my daughter nursed a wounded hero back to health, showing more genuine Christian virtue than you've displayed in all the years I've known you." "Hero?" Marcus's voice carried mockery. "The man is a broken-down cowboy who threw himself at a wild animal and lost a leg for his trouble. Hardly the stuff of legend, despite your daughter's romantic fantasies. He saved her life at enormous personal cost. That makes him more of a man than someone who threatens murder to achieve his business objectives." The confrontation had drawn the attention of everyone in the household. Maria Santos, the family cook, watched from the kitchen doorway with obvious satisfaction at seeing Marcus finally challenged. The stable hands clustered near the main entrance, their faces showing the relief of men who no longer had to pretend loyalty to someone they despised. But it was Eliza's voice that cut through the tension like a blade, carrying from the top of the curved staircase, where she stood in the wedding dress Marcus had forced her to wear. "Father, thank God you finally see him for what he is." She descended the stairs with regal dignity, every inch the railroad baron's daughter, despite her circumstances. The white silk dress that should have represented joy and new beginnings instead seemed like a burial shroud, beautiful but fundamentally wrong for the woman forced to wear it. "Eliza, my dear," Marcus said, his tone shifting to the patronizing sweetness he reserved for moments when he needed to manipulate rather than threaten. "You look magnificent. Surely you can see that this union represents the best possible outcome for everyone involved. I can see that you're a monster who threatens to murder innocent men when they inconvenience your plans," Eliza replied, her voice carrying a strength that would have been impossible before her ordeal in the mountains. "I can see that you forged my father's letter to manipulate me through false urgency and fear." Marcus's mask of civility slipped slightly. "You have no proof of such accusations. I have a father who loves me enough to point a gun at the man trying to destroy our family," Eliza said, reaching the bottom of the stairs. "I have household staff who've witnessed your threats and your casual cruelty. Most importantly, I have the knowledge that Wyatt Morgan is worth 10 of you, and I'll never willingly bind myself to someone capable of such evil." The sound of gunfire from outside the house interrupted the confrontation, echoing through the stone walls like thunder. Marcus's confident expression flickered for the first time, uncertainty replacing the smug assurance that had characterized his behavior since arriving at the estate. "It seems your hired killers have encountered some difficulty," Jonathan observed with grim satisfaction. "Perhaps you underestimated the opposition." Marcus signaled to the armed men he'd positioned throughout the house, his civilized facade finally cracking completely. "Kill anyone who tries to enter this house. The wedding proceeds as planned, regardless of outside interference." "No," Eliza said firmly, moving to stand beside her father. "The wedding is over before it begins. I will never marry you, Marcus, no matter what threats you make or what violence you're willing to employ." The standoff that followed was electric with tension, armed men facing each other across a space that had been designed for hospitality and family gatherings. Outside, the sounds of battle grew closer, suggesting that Wyatt and his allies had successfully breached the estate's outer defenses. Marcus drew his own weapon, a pearl-handled revolver that matched his expensive tastes, his eyes moving between father and daughter with the calculation of a predator assessing his options. "Then you'll both die with your principles intact," he said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had moved beyond negotiation to simple violence. The Colorado Territory Marshal's badge caught the lamplight as Samuel Torres pinned it to his chest, the six-pointed star representing law and justice in a land where both were often in short supply. He'd carried the badge for 12 years, though tonight was the first time he'd worn it openly in the Hartford household, revealing the dual identity that had allowed him to gather evidence against Marcus Thornfield's criminal enterprises. "United States Marshal Samuel Torres," he announced, his rifle trained on Marcus and his remaining men. "You're all under arrest for kidnapping, conspiracy, and threatening federal witnesses." Marcus's face went white with rage and disbelief. "You're a guide," A nobody who leads rich tourists through the mountains. I'm a federal marshal investigating reports of claim jumping, mine theft, and the systematic intimidation of legitimate property owners, Samuel replied calmly. Your business practices have attracted considerable attention from territorial authorities. The revelation recontextualized everything that had happened since the mountain lion attack. Samuel's presence with Eliza's expedition hadn't been coincidental. He'd been investigating Marcus's criminal activities and had seen an opportunity to gather evidence by positioning himself close to the Hartford family. Behind Marcus, Wyatt Morgan appeared in the main doorway, supported by his crutch, but moving with determined purpose. His clothes were torn from the fight outside, and blood streaked his face from various cuts and scrapes, but his eyes burned with the focused intensity of a man who had found his true purpose. It's over, Marcus, Wyatt said, his voice carrying quiet authority. Your hired guns are dead or fled. The territorial authorities know about your forged documents, your threats, your illegal mining operations. The only question now is whether you surrender peacefully or make this more difficult for everyone. You think a crippled cowboy and a part-time lawman can threaten me? Marcus snarled, his pearl-handled revolver swinging between targets as his desperation grew. I own half the territorial government. I have connections that reach all the way to Washington. You had connections, Samuel corrected. But threatening to murder federal witnesses tends to strain even the most corrupt relationships. Your partners in crime have been remarkably eager to cooperate once they understood the consequences of continued association with you. Eliza stepped forward, her wedding dress rustling against the stone floor as she moved with newfound confidence. The woman who had once been intimidated by social expectations now faced down an armed criminal with remarkable composure. It's finished, Marcus, she said firmly. Whatever hold you thought you had over my family, whatever threats you believed would ensure my compliance, they're meaningless now. I choose my own path, and that path leads as far from you as possible. Marcus's gun swung toward her, his finger tightening on the trigger as civilized restraint finally collapsed entirely. If I can't have you, then no one will. The shot that rang out was deafening in the enclosed space, but it didn't come from Marcus's weapon. Jonathan Hartford's silver-handled pistol smoked in his steady grip, and Marcus Thornfield crumpled to the floor, his pearl-handled revolver skittering across the polished stone. No one threatens my daughter, Jonathan said quietly, his voice carrying the finality of absolute resolution. No one. The immediate danger was over, but the aftermath would require careful handling. Samuel Torres moved efficiently to secure Marcus's remaining men, most of whom surrendered without resistance once they realized their employer was no longer in a position to pay their wages or protect them from legal consequences. Wyatt approached Eliza slowly, still favoring his injured leg, but moving with increasing confidence as his body adapted to its new limitations. When she turned toward him, her face lighting with relief and joy, he felt something settle in his chest, a sense of completion that had been missing since the mountain lion attack. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands gentle as they traced her face, checking for injuries that might not be immediately visible. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice shook slightly with reaction to the violence she'd just witnessed. "But you're bleeding. Just scratches, nothing that won't heal." They stood together in the aftermath of violence, two people who had found each other in circumstances neither could have imagined, who had chosen love despite obstacles that had seemed insurmountable. Around them, the practical business of law enforcement continued as Samuel Torres and Jonathan Hartford worked to secure evidence and ensure that Marcus's criminal network would be thoroughly investigated. "What happens now?" Eliza asked, her hands resting on Wyatt's chest as she felt the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. "Now we build the life we choose instead of the one that was chosen for us," Wyatt replied, his arms encircling her with infinite gentleness. We find that ranch we talked about, make it a place where courage and love matter more than social standing or inherited wealth. Together? If you'll have a one-legged cowboy who's discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures come from the simplest dreams. Eliza's answer was a kiss that tasted of joy and new beginnings, of futures chosen rather than accepted, of love that had triumphed over fear, through the simple act of refusing to surrender what mattered most. Outside the Hartford estate, snow continued to fall on the Colorado mountains, covering the evidence of violence with pristine white, and promising that spring would eventually come to heal even the deepest wounds. Inside the house that had briefly been a prison, three people who had learned the true meaning of courage began planning a future built on the solid foundation of choices made for the right reasons, regardless of the cost. The hand-forged wedding rings gleamed softly in the morning sunlight that streamed through the windows of the small church in Leadville, their simple silver bands catching the light like promises made in precious metal. The local blacksmith had crafted them, according to Wyatt's specifications, sturdy, honest rings that would wear well through years of hard work and simple living, symbols of love built on substance rather than show. 6 months had passed since that terrible night at the Hartford estate. 6 months during which the world had shifted in ways that would have seemed impossible during those first desperate days in the mountain cabin. Marcus Thornfield was dead, his criminal enterprises disbanded, and the territorial authorities had commended both Samuel Torres and Jonathan Hartford for their roles in exposing corruption that had reached far beyond Colorado's borders. Eliza stood at the altar in a simple blue dress that she'd chosen herself, free from the elaborate expectations that had once defined her every public appearance. Her father waited in the front pew, his face showing the complex mixture of pride and acceptance that came from watching a beloved daughter choose her own path, even when that path led away from everything he'd thought he wanted for her. Wyatt approached the altar with careful steps, his balance steady now, despite the absence of his left leg below the knee. The months of healing and adaptation had taught him new ways to move through the world, and the small ranch they'd purchased with Jonathan Hartford's wedding gift had provided the perfect place to prove that determination could overcome most physical limitations. The ranch itself was modest, 200 acres of good grazing land, nestled in a valley where the mountains provided shelter from harsh weather, while the creek ensured year-round water for livestock. The cabin Wyatt had built with help from Jake Morrison and Tom Stevens was sturdy and practical, with real glass windows and a stone fireplace that kept the interior warm even during the worst winter storms. But it was the horses that had truly convinced Eliza that their new life would be everything they'd dreamed. Wyatt's knowledge of bloodlines and training had proven as valuable as she'd predicted, and their small herd of breeding stock was already earning a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far away as Denver. "Do you, Wyatt Morgan," the minister said, his voice carrying through the small church to where friends and family had gathered to witness this union, "take this woman to be your wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Wyatt replied, his voice steady and strong. The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, a promise not just of love, but of the courage to continue choosing each other, regardless of what challenges the future might bring. "Do you, Eliza Hartford," the minister continued, "take this man to be your husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Eliza said, her voice clear and certain. She'd never spoken words that felt more true, more aligned with the person she'd discovered herself to be in that mountain cabin where love had first taken root. The exchange of rings was simple and profound, each band sliding into place with the satisfying weight of promises that would be kept through whatever trials lay ahead. When Wyatt slipped the silver band onto Eliza's finger, she thought of how far they'd both traveled from that first meeting on the mountain trail, how suffering and sacrifice had revealed truths about love that comfort and ease never could. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado," the minister announced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." The kiss that sealed their union was tender and deep, carrying the weight of everything they'd endured to reach this moment. Around them, the small gathering erupted in applause and well wishes, but for Wyatt and Eliza, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, and the promise they'd made to build a life together based on choices rather than circumstances. The reception that followed was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the meadow where wildflowers bloomed in abundance despite the approach of autumn. Jonathan Hartford had surprised everyone by rolling up his sleeves and helping with the preparations, his expensive Eastern suit replaced by practical work clothes that better suited the Colorado frontier. "I never thought I'd see the day when I'd be proud of my daughter for rejecting everything I spent 25 years trying to give her," he told Wyatt as they watched Eliza laugh with Maria Santos, who had traveled from Denver to serve as matron of honor. "But watching her these past months, seeing the woman she's become, I understand now that happiness can't be purchased or arranged." "She's stronger than either of us gave her credit for," Wyatt replied, accepting a glass of whiskey from Samuel Torres, who had taken leave from his marshal duties to attend the wedding. "Takes courage to choose an uncertain future over a safe, predetermined one. Takes courage to accept love from someone like her when you've got nothing material to offer in return," Jonathan countered. Not many men would have the confidence to believe they were enough. Wyatt considered this, thinking of all the doubts he'd overcome during the long months of healing and adaptation. "She taught me that being enough isn't about what you can provide, but about who you choose to be when everything else is stripped away." As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the mountain peaks, Eliza found herself standing beside the creek that ran through their property, watching the water tumble over smooth stones while she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place. The pearl locket she'd worn during that first expedition now held a different photograph, not her parents' formal wedding portrait, but a simple image of her and Wyatt taken outside their cabin, both of them smiling with the genuine happiness that came from lives lived authentically. "Thinking about that first day?" Wyatt asked, approaching with the careful gait that had become second nature over the months of adaptation. "Thinking about how sometimes the worst things that happen to us turn out to be the best things that could have happened," she replied, turning to face the man who had changed her understanding of what love could be. "If that mountain lion hadn't attacked, if you hadn't been hurt, we might never have discovered what we were capable of, separately or together," Wyatt finished. "Strange how tragedy can reveal blessings we never knew we needed." They stood together in the gathering twilight, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built, through determination and mutual support. The horses grazed peacefully in the meadow, their bloodlines carefully chosen to produce the kind of strong, intelligent animals that frontier life demanded. The cabin glowed with warm light from the windows, promising comfort and shelter through whatever seasons lay ahead. "Do you ever regret it?" Eliza asked quietly. "Giving up the life you might have had if things had been different?" Wyatt considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked about the sacrifice he'd made. The leg he'd lost to save her life would never grow back, and there would always be limitations and challenges that whole men didn't face. But the life he'd gained in exchange, the love, the purpose, the daily proof that courage could overcome almost any obstacle, seemed worth any price. "I regret the pain," he said finally. "I regret that you had to watch me suffer, had to nurse me through the worst of it, but I don't regret the choice, and I sure don't regret where that choice led us. Even when the work gets difficult, when the horses are stubborn and the weather's harsh and your leg aches from the old injury. Especially then," Wyatt replied, his arm tightening around her waist. "Because those are the moments when I remember that every challenge we face together is proof that we chose the right path, no matter how unlikely it seemed at the time." Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the same constellations that had watched over their love during those desperate weeks in the mountain cabin. But tonight they shone down on something permanent and strong, a marriage built on the solid foundation of mutual respect, shared hardship, and the kind of love that grew stronger under pressure rather than weaker. As they walked back toward the cabin where their wedding guests were beginning the evening celebration, Eliza thought about the compass rose carved into the wall of that long-ago shelter. They had chosen their direction, not from any map or predetermined plan, but by following the true north of their hearts toward a future they would create together, one day at a time, with courage and love as their only guides. The hand-forged rings on their fingers caught the last light of day, simple bands that would grow more beautiful with wear, just like the love they represented, a love that had been tested by fire and proven strong enough to last a lifetime.